I've done a video on the 12-step program before, but it's been a while, so I figured it was time I addressed this again, with a fresh pair of eyes. Should you follow the 12-step program? Is it helpful? What do their numbers look like? And for that matter, what are the 12 steps? Let's get into it. Before we get into it, I just want to mention that there are a few really good ways to show your support. I consolidated all the ways on my website, telltaleatheist.com. So if you want to read my blog articles, check out my retro games store, find out when I'm having meetups or conferences next, or any of that stuff, that's a pretty good central hub to find out. If you do go there, you'll find links to my Patreon, which is one of the best ways to support me, my merchandise store, which is also really good, and my retro games store. You'll also find links to my Twitter and Facebook and all kinds of other stuff. Links to all that stuff are also in the description, so check it out. Also, give my retro game channel a look. I just launched it recently. I talk about all kinds of game-related subjects. I think it's pretty interesting, but I'm probably biased. Anyways, let's take a look at the 12-step program. I want to preface this video by saying that I was an addict for a long time, and eventually I went to school for substance abuse counseling, so this is a very personal subject to me. I'm heavily invested in it. In fact, if you guys are curious, I'll tell you this for context. I take Suboxone now. I have for years, since I got clean. I tried quitting it recently, and it did not go well. I'll touch on it later. But this is another part of my personal life that I haven't talked about at great length, so let me just start from the beginning. When I was a kid, like 12, 13 years old, I was heavily isolated from society. As a young Jehovah's Witness, I wasn't supposed to talk to or hang out with outsiders, really. And there really weren't any Jehovah's Witnesses my age in my congregation. A couple, but they didn't like me much anyway, so I was left on my own. Then I started homeschooling around that time. From that point on, I was completely isolated from society. Couldn't have friends from the outside world. Didn't have friends from within Jehovah's Witnesses. Both my parents have bipolar disorder, so the only people I was ever around were two bipolar people. Now, I was lucky enough to make it out with mental disorders like bipolar disorder, which is really very lucky because bipolar disorder is hereditary. I could just as easily have had it as not. But either way, my personality was heavily shaped by the only people I was ever around for years. So even though I don't have bipolar disorder, which means I don't have massive emotional swings, being alone with nobody to talk to except for them for years still deeply affects your personality. I still say strange things sometimes. I make connections other people wouldn't make, that kind of thing. It stayed like that for 4 years. My mom worked and my dad slept because he was on intense painkillers. So the vast majority of those 4 years were spent completely alone. I remember watching live TV because I knew somewhere in the world the person I was watching at that very moment was doing what I was watching them do. It was a connection to the outside that I didn't have by any other means. So when I turned 16, I went back to public school. At this point, everybody I knew was in 11th grade. But since I hadn't really done any school work for that entire 4 years, I tested into 10th grade. But I still had to get all the credits for high school, the same as everybody else. So I was in 9th grade classes. At that point, I'd pretty much just spent the past 4 years not speaking to another living human. So I started trying to learn some social skills. I made a few friends, and from there, I pretty much completely discarded Jehovah's Witness doctrine. I decided to live my life the way I wanted to live it. Jehovah's Witnesses weren't working for me at all. So 11th grade rolls around and I was hanging out with people, going to parties, and drinking a little bit. I had a girlfriend who was basically worldly, non-Jehovah's Witness. She had some loose affiliation, but it wasn't much to speak of. At one of these parties, I ended up smoking a cigarette, and one of the Jehovah's Witnesses I went to school with caught wind of everything I was doing and decided to tell the elders about it. He was kind of spying on me. So the elders approached me and asked me about it, and I just told them everything. I had just turned 18 at this point. I think I might have been in 11th grade by now, taking 10th grade classes. Basically still had 2 years of high school remaining. So the elders set up a judicial committee and they disfellowshipped me. On my 18th birthday, still in 11th grade, I was kicked out of my house. I had to crawl in the window of this girl I knew and stayed in her bedroom for 3 weeks before I finally found a place to live. People don't realize what goes into hiding in a bedroom from a family for 3 weeks. I tried to plan when I'd use the bathroom because I didn't want them to know I was there. She would bring her food to the bedroom and eat it there so we could both eat. I'd sneak back out the window to go to work every day. She'd go outside and watch to make sure nobody was around so I could climb out. Eventually, I ended up marrying her 9 months later, and my daughter, Kylie, was born 9 months to the day after the wedding. Anyways, I found a place to live a few weeks later with a coworker. He had an extra bedroom at his place. The bed he had in his bedroom was smaller than a twin. I don't know what size goes below twin, but it was basically a kid's bed. My feet hung off the end. But it was a place to sleep, and as time went on, I found myself around more and more questionable people, and eventually I got into drug use. I know I've told this story before, but it's been a while, and I feel like the story is relevant to understanding why I found myself where I am today. All of this was the result of leaving religion. If I hadn't been abandoned by my friends and family, if I hadn't been isolated from society for a good portion of my life, I wouldn't have found myself in those types of situations. Now, I can't blame it entirely on Jehovah's Witnesses. I did make those choices myself, but I wouldn't have been faced with those choices if I hadn't been abandoned by everybody like that. Drug use was a coping mechanism for the terrible shit I had just experienced, for everything that I'd lost. After a couple years of drug use, I finally discovered a medication called Suboxone, which gives you the opportunity to deal with the emotional issues that led to drug use in the first place while preventing physical withdrawal. This was about 8 years ago. That's how long I've been on Suboxone. Here's a layman explanation of how it works. You've got 4 opioid receptors in your brain. Each one acts on certain things. If you have opioids in your body, the receptors will affect your physical body, which is what morphine does by killing pain. They'll affect your mental state by giving you euphoria, and they'll affect other stuff too. An opioid that affects all 4 receptors is called a full opioid agonist, like OxyContin or heroin. An opioid that affects only some of the receptors is called a partial opioid agonist. Tramadol or Ultram are partial opioid agonists because they affect a single opioid receptor. Suboxone affects 2 of the 4. So when I take Suboxone, it doesn't give me euphoria. The only thing it does for me is it puts off withdrawal symptoms. Eventually, I'll have to get off of it, but that's really gonna suck because the withdrawal pain from Suboxone lasts about 3 times longer than withdrawal pain from heroin. But I'll cross that bridge when I come to it. I did try fairly recently. About 6 months ago, I started cutting my dose dramatically, and it literally felt like my skin was being melted off with a blowtorch. Sorry for the graphic description, but I felt like it was valuable, so people understand what's involved. So how does a 12-step program fit into all of this? Well, when I entered recovery for addiction, the 12-step program, also known as Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous, wouldn't take me because I was on Suboxone. They said it was trading one drug for another, which is a perspective I can understand, but first of all, that's a little rich coming from AA, and second, maybe it is trading one drug for another, but I'm not getting high from it, and I'm a productive, tax-paying member of society now, where I wasn't before, so it's preferable, whether they like it or not. Suboxone allowed me to become a productive member of society where I wasn't before. So why do I say it's rich coming from Alcoholics Anonymous? Because eventually I ended up going to school for substance abuse counseling, and I learned all about how things affect your brain on a basic level. Let's take a look at the 12 steps and see what they're really doing to people. Step number 1. We admitted we're powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable. Of course, this applies to narcotics too, not just alcohol. This one is a little ambiguous, but at its face, without the context you gain from going to an AA meeting, it seems pretty innocuous. Admit that you have a problem. Okay, I can get on board with that, especially because it's one of the 5 stages of grief, denial. Admit it's a problem and go from there. Number 2, came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. What? What's this doing here? Came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. Now the last one's starting to make sense. You're powerless alone, and you need God to help you quit. Just wait, it gets even more questionable. Number 3, made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God. Something else the 12-step program likes to bake into you is that once you're an addict, you're always an addict. For life. You're always sick. You can never get better. And you will always need the 12-step program and or God to prevent you from falling short. It's an extremely religious message. I am not an addict anymore. I used to be an addict. I understand I have the predisposition to get addicted to substances, but I refuse to listen to somebody tell me I'm sick, I'll always be sick, and I need their program to get better for the rest of my life. Modern 12-step programs are kind of moving away from the God model, but you still have a higher power. It's really hard to have a program built this way without having the foundations upon which it's built. How do you exclude God from a 12-step program that has him through so many of these steps? Number 4, made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. I guess I can see how reflecting on how far your morals have fallen since becoming an addict could be helpful. I'll let this one slide, but again, it's completely based around God. Number 5, admitted to God, ourselves, and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. Why is God even in this step? Because God acts on the brain in the same place as drugs do. So their goal is to replace the drugs with a belief in a divine being. More specifically, the Christian God. In a benevolent dictator whose who's always watching what you're doing and judging you for it. But here's one of my main qualms with that philosophy. What happens when your faith is challenged? You can't face having your faith challenged. It risks sending you right back into addiction. It's objectively a bad idea to have people replace drugs with Jesus. Yes, I said objectively bad. The reason I say that is because their long-term success rate is terrible. The success rate is hard to pin down because addicts aren't going around reporting that they went back to addiction after leaving, but it's estimated to be around 5 to 10% who stay clean long-term. Now, I understand addicts are addicts, and they might want to get help, but might not be ready yet. That happens. But I'd be a lot more understanding of this program if it was based off of psychology in any way. It's not. It was founded by a church, it's run by churches, the meetings are held in churches. It isn't a psychology-based counseling program, it's a church program. Number 6, we're entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character. There is no God. Number 7, humbly ask Him to remove our shortcomings. This is the same as step 6. Number 8, made a list of all persons we had harmed, and became willing to make amends to all of them. This one, from a psychology perspective, could be okay, I guess. But it isn't really for the addict's benefit. It's for the other's benefit more than anything. So take that for what you will. Number 9, make direct amends to such people wherever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others. They could have combined steps 8 and 9. Number 10, continue to take personal inventory, and when we were wrong, promptly admitted it. This is an okay step, but again, not based on psychology. There are secular drug rehab programs that are written up and planned out by actual psychologists. Unfortunately, we don't know their long-term success rate yet because the 12-step program has had a monopoly on drug rehab for decades. Court systems order people to go to AA or NA, not to secular therapy. Still working on getting studies for secular programs, but it's a very long process. Number 11, sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood Him, praying only for knowledge of His will for us and the power to carry that out. Again, trying to get people to replace the drug with God. I would love it if they based the program on science instead of religion. Number 12, having had a spiritual awakening as the result of these steps, we try to carry this message to alcoholics and to practice these principles in all our affairs. You find this one in pretty much every religion. Proselytize, spread the message. I hear the same thing from every major religion. They got some of these points right, but the ones they did get right were pretty much just by chance. Not because they knew what they were doing. A broken clock is right twice a day. If you struggle with addiction, or if you know somebody who is, do yourself a favor and find a secular therapy group. The 12-step program is not based on science. It was founded and run by religion. Anyways, that's all I've got for you. Don't forget that there are a few really good ways to show your support. I consolidated all the ways on my website, telltaleatheist.com. So if you want to read blog articles I write, check out my retro game store, find out when I'm having meetups or conferences next, or any of that stuff. That's a pretty good central hub to find out. But if you do go there, you'll find links to my Patreon, which is one of the best ways to support me, my merchandise store, which is also really good, and my retro game store. You'll also have links to my Twitter and Facebook and all kinds of other stuff. Also give my retro game channel a look. I just launched it recently. I talk about all kinds of game-related subjects. Links to everything are also in the description, so check it out. Okay, thanks for watching, guys.